Welcome back to What's New in Unity 6.0 Release Notes. We're heading on down to URP, the Universal Render Pipeline. They added the 8192 by 8192 option to shadow texture resolution for the main light and additional lights. They added the Camera History API, which lets you access per camera history textures and use them in custom render passes. History textures are the color and depth textures that Unity rendered for each camera in previous frames. They added Adaptive Probe Volumes, APV, lighting scenario blending to URP. They added a new config package that lets you override the maximum number of visible lights. They added the Render Graph Viewer window. This tool lets you visualize how render passes use frame resources and debug the rendering process. The rendering debugger now contains a mip-map streaming section. This section lets you inspect the texture streaming activity. They added C# script templates to create custom post-processing effects that use a volume component. They added APV sky occlusion support for URP. They added support for spatial temporal post-processing, STP upscaling. The new render graph system improves the way you customize and maintain the render pipeline. The system reduces the amount of memory URP uses and makes memory management more efficient. This URP version implements the alpha processing setting. If you enable this setting, URP renders the post-processing alpha to a render texture with an alpha channel. In previous versions, URP discarded the alpha channel by replacing alpha values with 1. They added cross-platform HDR display support. The editor and built players now provide full HDR tone mapping and display support across all rendering pipelines and platforms that support HDR, including mobile and XR. Added per vertex quality levels for indirect lighting from probe volumes so that URP renders lit environments more efficiently. On mobile platforms, URP doesn't support lighting scenario blending or lighting normalization for reflection probes. Added the camera and objects option in the motion blur volume component. The option uses motion vectors to blur objects that move faster than the camera's exposure time. They added support for additional directional light cookies. They added the default volume profile field to URP global settings. And they added volume profile field to the universal render pipeline asset. They added alembic velocity motion vector support for URP materials. They added automatic time-based motion vector generation for shader graph shaders with vertex animation based only on the time node. They added support for XR rendering and orthographic projection cameras to forward plus rendering path. And they added support for foveated rendering in the forward plus rendering path. They added temporal anti-aliasing (TAA) support. The feature is not compatible with MSAA, dynamic resolution, or camera stacking. The feature only supports fixed resolution and does not support temporal upsampling. Added support for high dynamic range HDR output. Added the detailed stats section to URP rendering debugger. They ported all URP passes to use the raster command buffer API. They added the AO method property to SSAO settings where you can select the options interleaved gradients noise or blue noise. They added the blur quality property to SSAO settings where you can select the options high, bilateral, medium, Gaussian, or low, single pass Kawais. Added the fall off field to SSAO settings to control the distance from the camera where the AO effect is applied. They added the clustered reflection probe support to the URP forward plus rendering path. This enables the use of more than 2 reflection probes per object and allows Unity to skip per object culling of lights and reflection probes and enables entities graphics and procedural draws to make use of reflection probes. Added the low-code custom post-processing feature in URP. Added decal support to RenderGraph API. Added RenderGraph API support to URP post-processing effects. Added support for shadow rendering to 2D objects, such as sprites, colliders, sprite shape, and 2D animation. Added soft shadow rendering to shadow casting 2D lights. Added a limited support of probe volumes with no interpolation of light data sets and limited performance on lower-end hardware. And finally, they improved FXAA quality. The new implementation provides better edge anti-aliasing, removing odd edge artifacts seen in the previous implementation, and better retention of texture quality. The improvement does not affect performance. The output quality is now comparable to the low and medium SMAA presets, but with better performance. And that was all the changes in URP in Unity 6.0. I'm Michael with Ready Play Games, and I hope you liked it.